Hey everybody, I wanted to review the anatomy of the shoulder so that you guys could better understand what's going on. If you've got an MRI or you're just curious as to what's going on in the shoulder, what some of these terms mean, I want to explain it in about 5 minutes. So here is a person's right shoulder. If you kind of conceptualize, that's my clavicle. This is like a right shoulder taken off the body or off the skeleton. If you look at it in 3 dimensions, that's looking at the person from the right. There's their arm swinging in the socket. That's the ball and socket joint that you could see right there. This is called your humerus. That little cup there is called the glenoid. So it's a glenohumeral joint. That's what we think of when it's the shoulder, but if you think about it, this is the shoulder. This is your collarbone. It sits right in my sternum right there. You can see that little bump there. You can see this bump outside here. That's my acromion and where my clavicle meets that. So that in the back is my scapula. So those are the bony parts of the shoulder, and they'll really kind of briefly talk about that on the MRI. What they're really looking at is the soft tissue on the MRI, and they'll comment a lot on that. So they'll look at the rotator cuff. If you look at this scapula, it's pretty amazing. You'll see these big divots here. It's almost like a tunnel because all the muscles have been stripped off this scapula. These little portions of the scapula are where the rotator cuff sits. So the rotator cuff lives on top of the scapula. That little groove there that you can see my finger going through, and it actually goes over to the shoulder itself. That's where one of my muscles on the backside of my shoulder lives. That's one of the 4 rotator cuff muscles. That's where your supraspinatus lives. Under here, under this spine, is called your infraspinatus. That's attaching to the shoulder as well. There's another one down here, all the way down here, called your teres minor that attaches to the shoulder. And then the undersurface of my scapula, under here, between the scapula and my rib cage, is your 4th rotator cuff muscle called your subscapularis. It's under the scapula. So the take-home point is the rotator cuff is 4 separate muscles. They all basically function to hug the glenohumeral joint. They capture your humerus and suck it into the socket. So that's what they're there for. They're meant to stabilize this joint as it moves. So we do all these kind of crazy movements with our shoulder. That ball better stay in the center of that socket or well planted into the socket while I'm lifting a gallon of milk or throwing a baseball or putting on my overhead shirt that I have to pull it on over my head. All the job of the rotator cuff is to keep this ball and socket joint right there in very good alignment. So your MRI might say tearing of the infraspinatus or supraspinatus, and they're just referring to out here where the tendon is, where the muscles end in tendons, and where that tendon attaches to this little ridge here on your humerus. There's wear and tear that occurs throughout that area, known as rotator cuff tears. So they'll see degeneration of the tissue, or actually traumatic breaking of the tissue if you fall. And you can imagine getting an arm tugged really hard where it almost gets dislocated or does get dislocated. That tissue, as we get older, tends to fail, and we get rotator cuff tears with trauma. So there are very few older people north of 65 that could dislocate their shoulder without tearing their rotator cuff because it's not pliable enough. So the MRI will report rotator cuff tears in that region along where my finger is going. When a rotator cuff is torn, all that means is that it's not in a state where it can do its job, which is to hug that shoulder into place and hug that glenohumeral joint and let it move freely without that ball moving around too much. If I don't have a rotator cuff and I go to elevate my arm, so this guy is facing this way, that's me standing like that. When I go to elevate my arm, there should be some space there that remains under that little bony shelf called your acromion. When the rotator cuff can't do its job, that bone is going to bang around in that socket and cause impingement symptoms. You're going to see tissue get pinched in there. You're going to get that bone banging into that bony shelf, banging into that ligament in the front here that kind of completes that arch. And you're going to get aggravation. You're going to get pain. You're going to compress structures inside there, and you're going to stir up problems. So that's kind of what they're going to see with like fluid buildup in that area in little tiny sacs that are meant to make things move freely without friction. those sacs get banged around, and that's called bursitis. So this little thin bursa now gets banged around by a rotator cuff not doing its job, and now you get swelling in the bursa. You'll get an aggravation of the bursa itself, and then you'll get bursitis. So they'll say subacromial bursitis. That just means that bursa sac underneath this shelf has filled with fluid and then has become aggravated. So that's basically the main findings. They'll talk about rotator cuff involvement on your MRI and tearing in this area. That's basically the tendon of your rotator cuff muscles. They'll also talk about the bursitis. That means fluid buildup in the sacs underneath there that are meant to prevent friction in the shoulder when we're doing so much work with it. They'll also talk about a labrum. There's the cup of the shoulder in there, and lining that cup, if you could think of like a gasket to make things fit better. So this shoulder fits in this cup. It doesn't look like the cup's very deep, but in the actual human body, there's a big labrum around the rim of that, which makes the cup deeper and essentially helps stabilize the shoulder. So with traumatic problems or overhead activity like pitching, we could have that ball bang around too much into that labrum and tear the labrum. So that you'll see some labral injuries on MRI. Those are more difficult to diagnose with an MRI, but you'll also see a more active athlete, and they'll be diagnosed with some labral tears in there. That's another totally different surgery than a rotator cuff. But those are the main findings: the rotator cuff tendon issues, bursa filling with fluid, and also labral injuries. If you could also imagine, I want to clear this up, if you could imagine on this model, this bone banging into that arch and banging around there, that's a ligament that goes from this bone to this bone, and it gives structure to that shoulder. When you bang that enough and aggravate it, you're going to get calcification of that tissue. That means calcium is going to infiltrate that tissue and make it appear more like bone on an x-ray. So if you've gotten a shoulder x-ray and you really bang this up quite a bit, you're going to start to see like almost like bone growth down into the ligament, and it'll look like a big thorn on your x-ray, growing down into your area. So you'll see some degeneration around there. Osteophyte formation, that just means extra bone is growing around that issue right there, around your clavicle and acromion. So you'll see this bone growth, and that could create a limited space in there. So if you'll see that hooked acromion or osteophyte formation, it just means extra bone around this area, and you'll also see that calcification of that ligament. That little red thing there is your biceps tendon. That's the long head of your biceps, which actually goes all the way across your shoulder joint and attaches to your labrum. So it's oftentimes this tendon itself gets banged up with overhead activity, and that's pretty much the structures that you'll see noted on your MRI. Those are the types of injuries that they'll diagnose through an MRI, and I hope that helps you understand what that scan may have read.